Good evening, Atonement. Welcome to worship this Wednesday, March 18th. We are continuing our Lenten Wednesdays on the Enneagram. Tonight we are looking at Enneagram types 2, 3, and 4. But before we get there, let's turn to our scripture this evening, Psalm 46. From Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a help always near in times of great trouble. That's why we won't be afraid when the world falls apart, when the mountains crumble into the center of the sea, when its waters roar and rage, when the mountains shake because of its surging waves. There is a river whose streams gladden God's city, the holiest dwelling of the Most High. God is in that city. It will never crumble. God will help it when the mountain dawns. Nations roar, kingdoms crumble. God utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of heavenly forces is with us. The God of Jacob is our place of safety. Come, see the Lord's deeds. What devastation he has imposed on the earth, bringing wars to an end in every corner of the world, breaking the bow and shattering the spear, burning chariots with fire. That's enough. Now know that I am God. I am exalted among all the nations. I am exalted throughout the world. The Lord of heavenly forces is with us. The God of Jacob is our place of safety. So I'm going to talk about Psalm 46 in a couple minutes, but first what I want to do is I want to start with talking about the Enneagram for just a couple minutes, and then I'm going to pivot to reflecting on all that's going on in our world right now. But if you were really eager to hear a much more thorough introduction to Enneagram types 2, 3, and 4, let me show you a couple of resources. First, go to our website. We have a preaching series right now that is talking about that. This past Sunday, Pastor Greg talked about Enneagram types 2, and going back to February 23rd, he talked about Enneagram type 3 here on the Life as a Swiftie sermon. If you're wondering how I got to this page, if you go to our homepage, which is at-onechurch.org, and then you scroll down a little bit, you will see this recent sermons section. And if you just click to see more sermons online, you will find all of our archive of sermons, which will be March 15th for Enneagram Type 2 and February 23rd for Enneagram Type 3. But if you want even more than this, go check out the book we've been using as our guidebook for this series. The book is called The Road Back to You. It's written by Ian Morgan Cron and Suzanne Stabile. But if you want even more than this, or you're looking for something other than a book, these two, Cron and Stabile, have a wonderful podcast where they interview people of a variety of Enneagram types. So go find a conversation on their podcast with people that are Enneagram types 2, 3, and 4. As you can see, the website is called theroadbacktoyou.com, and then from there you can navigate to podcast and then find a conversation with someone that's of that type. Perhaps if you are an Enneagram type 3, you can listen to this conversation with Jim Danaher. Anyways, let's keep on going. People who are an Enneagram types 2, 3, and 4 are in what is called the heart triad, sometimes called the feeling triad or the emotional triad. People who are in this triad are described or characterized by being led by their emotions, perhaps over and against, like by their reasoning or their thinking. I've done some research on what exactly this even means, to be driven by one's heart or one's emotions. And the explanation that I found that makes the most sense to me is that people in this triad view the world through the lens of relationships. People in this triad are especially attuned to the moods and the feelings of others. Might we say they're especially concerned about the heart of others. Folks who are 2, 3, and 4 are especially attuned to others' feelings so that they can meet their own needs for contact, connection, and approval. And this manifests slightly different for each type. As Greg discussed on Sunday, the type 2 are often called the helpers. Or as this image, which I'm about ready to show you here, describes it, they are called the givers. These are types that give and give and give, love and love and love, all the while wondering, will others like me? Am I needed? They yearn to receive love back. They value relationship and hope to earn it through how they care for others. Then there's the 3, which is the performer. They are especially concerned about how they function, how they do, how they perform, how can they gain the respect and esteem of others. They act through how I'm acting, how will others think about me and view me. There are a lot of business slogans out in the world about hoping to earn our business. That's kind of the attitude and posture through which how Enneagram types 3 go through the world. And then finally, there's type 4. It's cut off a little bit in this image here, in their description below, but Enneagram 4s are a little bit different than 2s and 3s. They're often called the individualist. This image calls it the romantic, which is interesting alongside the other 2 that are deeply interested in human connection. 4s are interested in connection too, but in a little bit of a different way. 4s are deeply concerned with how they can express themselves, how they can be their own unique individual. And they can't do this without being in connection with others. They're trying to figure out how can I be self-expressive and speak to what is deeply within me. They, as a result, tend to be a little bit more reserved and a little bit more moody than most of the other types on the Enneagram, but they nevertheless are deeply driven by human connection in their own way and by their feelings, by their heart. Now, as I think about these Enneagram types 2, 3, and 4, those that are in the heart triad, and their deep need for human connection, I'm struck by what a weird season of human connection we're in right now, amidst this season of social distancing as we seek to flatten the curve of the coronavirus outbreak. And what a weird season it is to be church as we gather digitally. Nevertheless, we are gathering as the body of Christ, but in front of our computers as opposed to at Martin Drive. And also amidst this coronavirus outbreak, I've seen this letter written by the namesake of Lutheranism, a guy named Martin Luther, that's been popping up a lot for me lately. This letter was written in 1527, and Luther wrote it soon, just a bit after there was a outbreak of the bubonic plague, of the Black Death in the town in which he lived. Now, this wasn't like the most famous and the largest outbreak of the bubonic plague. That had happened about 200 years earlier, which meant people in Wittenberg knew of this disease and were familiar with it, because every decade or so there would be it would come back a little bit, and it wasn't as severe as the Great Black Death that began in 1346 that killed like half of Europe. That was just awful. I mean, more people died in 1346 to 1351, I think, than in all of World War II. So this was an awful, awful outbreak that people knew about. And so in 1527, people were terrified and were literally just running away and making Wittenberg a ghost town, leading Luther to write this treatise, this letter called Whether a Christian Should Flee the Deadly Plague. Now, I read a lot of Luther in seminary, but I didn't read this letter. I didn't even know this letter existed. So I've done some more research lately about what was going on at the time of the writing of this letter and what was significant about it. And the thing that struck me is that right around the time Luther wrote this letter, Luther actually also began writing his most famous song, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. Now, I wasn't raised Lutheran, so I don't have as much of a connection to the song as many people at Atonement do, but in my limited experience as a Lutheran, I've grown to know this song as the song that begins worship on Reformation Sunday. It's this loud, big, song that feels like that seems to be celebrating victory. Many people have called it the battle hymn of the Reformation. It's this song that we seem to use to function like, yeah, we're Lutheran, and yes, we're glad that Luther started the church 500 years ago. But the interesting thing, though, is that he didn't write this at the time when the Reformation began in 1517. He wrote it 10 years later, amidst the season of the outbreak of the Black Death in his own town. And now a lot can change in 10 years. To prove this point, I've actually dug up some old pictures of me from 10 years ago, just to give you an idea. Let's turn and look at them now. So 10 years ago, when I was on a spring break in college, I went on a service trip to Denver. And this is a picture taken of me clearly loving being up early in the morning. You can see 10 years, a long time. Not super proud of this picture. And then 10 years ago in the fall, I went and studied abroad in Namibia. And this is me riding a donkey. And then one more time, when I was in Namibia 10 years ago, this is me chewing on some sugar cane. Actually didn't taste very good, but I thought it looked pretty cool in that picture. So that's me 10 years ago. So as you can see by looking at these pictures of me from 10 years ago and looking at me now, you can see a lot can change in 10 years. 10 years, that's a long time. And that 10 years is the gap of time between when the Reformation started and when Luther wrote this song. This leads me to think A Mighty Fortress Is Our God is not a song celebrating the beginning of the Reformation. I actually think this song was written as a response to the Black Death, because in a season when he's writing to encourage Christians to continue to care for those that are suffering from disease, he paraphrases Psalm 46, the psalm I read at the beginning of this sermon, as the base for the song. God is our refuge and strength, a help always near in times of great trouble. That's why we won't be afraid when the world falls apart. The Lord of heavenly forces is with us. The God of Jacob is our place of safety. I wonder if Luther read that every night before he went to bed, or he would read that to himself as he was thinking through what to say in his letter encouraging Christian care for those around him as they suffered from the bubonic plague. Now, in this letter, Luther encourages people to not be afraid of the Black Death. But I don't think that should be read as him saying, don't worry about how bad the coronavirus is. If anything, I think the opposite is the case, because throughout this letter, he contrasts fear and serving the neighbor, particularly those that are most affected by the disease. And he sees fear as an obstacle to caring for those around him. And Luther argues strenuously in favor of care and concern for those that are suffering from this disease. Like, for instance, let me read you one snippet from this letter that he writes. He loves talking about the devil in very colorful ways, so it makes it kind of an amusing read too. So let me read that to you now. We know that it is the devil's game to induce such fear and dread. We should in turn minimize it. Take such courage as to spite and annoy him, and send those terrors right back at him. And we should arm ourselves with this answer to the devil. Get away, you devil, with your terrors. Just because you hate it, I'll spite you more by going the more quickly to help my sick neighbor. I'll pay no attention to you. I've got 2 heavy blows to use against you. The first one is that I know that helping my neighbor is a deed well-pleasing to God and all the angels. By this deed I do God's will and render true service and obedience to him. The second blow against the devil is God's mighty promise by which he encourages those who minister to the needy. So in other words, Luther connects the devil with the disease and all that comes with it, with the fear and the suffering and the death. And then Luther contrasts that with God and the will of God and the work of God, which is the healing and the caring of the sick and the protection from the disease. And so as God's people, we are called, like what Luther says, to resist the disease and resist all the suffering it causes. And the best way we can do this right now is through social distancing to prevent any further spread of coronavirus, or at least to stem the spread as much as we possibly can. And we do this out of concern for the most vulnerable, whether the elderly, those with health conditions, those that are really in economic tight shape, like those without homes, those that are most at risk from this disease. And now I also got to say that after I read this section where Luther talks a lot about the devil and connects the devil with the disease, I wonder if that causes us to read when Martin Luther talks about the devil and a mighty fortress is our God a bit differently. Just listen to the words of the third verse of this hymn. Don't they seem eerily relevant in light of what I just read? And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear. God hath willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. Isn't that eerily similar? It's as if Luther is saying, yes, disease may be present in our world. Yes, there's fear and there's death. And certainly not enough toilet paper and hand sanitizer. And yes, the disease may even get worse before it gets better. But we can endure the rage of this devilish disease because it will lose. Because it will lose, because God will win, because God will triumph. God will triumph through us, through our resistance, through our work to medical care, through our commitment to care for those that are most vulnerable, through our concern with social distancing. This disease will lose. And God will win. And so in a couple minutes, we're going to sing this song. I have both a traditional version of it with a chorus and with an organ, and I also have a more contemporary version. They're both great. Just sing along and sing this as a song of resistance against coronavirus and as a song of trust in God's saving power. But before we sing this song, let me read you something I saw on Facebook. It was written in a clergy Facebook group about clergy persons trying to struggle to make sense and resist coronavirus as best we can. And it's written by Heidi Newmark. She's a Lutheran pastor in New York. And of all the pastors I've come into contact or know of, she's probably the most gifted pastor I've met. She writes the following on our Facebook page. Remembering. After September 11th, I frequently visited a member of my Bronx congregation on the burn unit of the New York Presbyterian Hospital, where most of the September 11th burn survivors were being treated. No matter what time of day or night I visited the unit, a particular hospital chaplain was there. I wondered how she managed, day after day, facing so much pain and suffering, so many lives undone. One day, when I saw her in the hallway, I asked her how she was holding up. She looked at me and gave me a voice to my worst fears. I'm not holding up, she said. Then there was a pause as she took a deep breath. I'm not holding up, she repeated. I'm being held up. Heidi then writes, I pray that you are being held up in God's mercy in all the ways you need to make it through each day. And that's my prayer for you as well. I pray that you are being held up in God's mercy in all the ways that you need to make it through each day. Amen.